Hello. Trans rights are human rights. And yet, stuff keeps happening. So what's up? Before I talk about the absolute bullshit, let's talk about the FCC. Whoops. So the board of the FCC has been at a 2-2 partisan standstill since the beginning of the Biden administration. You may remember that in the previous administration, the FCC just killed net neutrality because they wanted to. And by they, I mean the corporations who were negatively affected by net neutrality wanted to. Notable piece of shit Ajit Pai led that crusade and then is no longer at the FCC. And there's a hole there. Biden appointed somebody, but they have to be approved by the Senate, and that didn't happen originally. Now, like 2 years later, there's somebody else possibly being appointed, possibly being approved by the Senate, so that the FCC could possibly do something that helps people. But until then, we just have to enjoy having an entire political party whose sole purpose is not letting the government help its citizens. All right. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is a fascist and does not deserve a life of peace and happiness. He very recently signed a massive flurry of anti-queer legislation, especially targeting trans people. Notably, I said trans people, not trans children, trans people of all ages. The most eye-popping headline, the one that's being talked about the most, is the one that lets the state take children away from their families for receiving gender-affirming care, which is not a sex change. Children are not getting sex changes. Gender-affirming care can be as simple as talking to a counselor about what they are feeling. Of course, this was never about the children and is entirely about hate. And they're just hiding behind children, using them as political pawns to roll out legislation that directly harms trans adults as well. And so some of this legislation severely restricts access to trans healthcare for adults. This includes, but is not limited to, who is allowed to actually prescribe medication for trans adults. Nurse practitioners are no longer allowed to do that. Why? I don't fucking know. Maybe it's because they hate trans people and want them to not exist. And so they've played up this whole "we're trying to save the children" thing as a way to allow you to approve of genocide, weaving a completely false narrative out of thin air that didn't exist just a couple of years ago about how suddenly trans people are targeting children, and now we have to act. And the way we solve the problem is apparently limiting healthcare for even adults. Again, it was never about the children. Be smart here. There's no rationalizing this. There is no reason. There is nothing beyond power and marginalization. They do not have an end goal here except eradication. There is no boon that they think this is going to bring to the country. There is no reason for them to be doing this. They are doing this because they have the power to do it, and that is the only way that they can reach climax. The current rumor is that Ron DeSantis is going to launch his presidential campaign as soon as next week. All right, shifting gears just a little bit. The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom has sold 10 million copies in 3 days. I want to put that in perspective for you. Breath of the Wild, the predecessor to this game, over its 6-year lifespan, sold 30 million copies. Red Dead Redemption 2, a massively successful cross-platform launch, sold 17 million copies in its first quarter. Neither of these games have Ultra Hand. And that, my dear viewer, is why Tears of the Kingdom is the superior game. The governor of Montana has signed a bill into law that I previously talked about that bans TikTok from the state. Specifically, it bans the distribution and operation of TikTok from the state. You aren't liable if you're just a person using it, but you are liable if you're distributing it. So Apple and Google. So first of all, this doesn't go into effect for a little while, and they probably did that on purpose to allow it to be targeted in courts and struck down, because everyone understands that this is not constitutional. Like, including the people who proposed it. They're not proposing it because they want to get rid of TikTok, and they're not proposing it because they think it's going to do anything. They're just trying to score political points. And so they get to say that they banned the Big Bad China app, and then they get to point to the opposition that strikes the bill down and being like, look, they're pro-China, and we just have to deal with it. It's probably going to be struck down in court, but if it's not, it's probably not going to do anything, because it's costing these companies $10,000 a day to violate this law, and that's not a lot of money for them. That's like 1 week's travel budget, maybe. Lightning round! Disney is canceling a $1 billion development project in Florida, seemingly to strike back at DeSantis in their ongoing kerfuffle. Sony has released an accessible video game controller for the PS5, similar to the accessible Xbox controller. Marjorie Taylor Greene has introduced articles of impeachment for Biden, and they're not going to go anywhere. Similar to the Southwest pilots that just voted in favor of a strike, FedEx pilots are also voting overwhelmingly in favor of a strike as they continue to negotiate for better pay. The Supreme Court declined to take up the case to reevaluate Section 230, and finally for today, having not paid rent on his offices in months, Elon Musk says the only way that he'll pay rent is over his dead body, citing that San Francisco is a shithole. I don't think most landlords will take that reasoning. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Stuff Keeps Happening. Head to stuffkeepshappening.online for sources, bonus content, and probably some bonus content that involves me getting a little heated in the future. My name is Endeavorance. I'll be back on Monday. Take care and be well.